Okay. Salam, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us this Friday evening. I hope everyone is keeping safe, healthy, and well. So, as is our tradition with CCMW events, I would like to begin our gathering with Surah Fatiha. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين. الرحمن الرحيم. مالك يوم الدين. إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين. اهدنا الصراط المستقيم. صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. Ameen. Now for the translation. So, in the name of Allah, the most compassionate, the most merciful. All praise is for Allah, Lord of the worlds, the most compassionate, the most merciful, Master of the Day of Judgment. You alone we worship, and you alone we ask for help. Guide us along the straight path, the path of those you have blessed, not those you're displeased with, or those who are astray. I would also like to take a moment to acknowledge the land that we're on today. This land is the territory of the Huron-Wendat and Piton First Nations, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. This territory was a subject of the Dishut One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and the Confederacy of the Ojibwe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Today, the meeting place of Toronto is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work in the community on this territory. I would also like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and to any who may be here with us today, physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. Miigwech. Now, before I pass the mic to our next speaker, I would like to go over a few quick housekeeping notes. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be made available on our YouTube channel. A link will also be sent to all of you after the event. We welcome your comments and questions. There will be a live Q&A session at the end of the presentation. You can use the chat function or the Q&A box to submit your questions, and we'll take them up after the presentation. Lastly, a post-event survey will be emailed to you later today. It takes less than 2 minutes, and it helps us plan future events and programming. Now let's welcome our Executive Director, Nuzhat Jaffrey, who will introduce our speaker and share a bit more about the series. Thank you.
Zainab. And good evening, everyone. Assalamu alaikum. I'm so pleased to welcome you to our Muslim Women Scholars series. And every time Dr. Naveen Rida makes the presentation, we'll walk away with a lot more knowledge because she's very generous sharing what she knows. And I'm sure this seminar is not going to be any different. Today's topic is making sense of the book of Joshua, the Bible, the Qur'an, and genocide. And it's being presented to you with CCMW in collaboration with Emmanuel College. Before Naveen begins, I'd like to introduce you to her. She's one of her favorite speakers. Naveen Rida is Associate Professor of Muslim Studies at Emmanuel College of Victoria University in the University of Toronto. Her research interests include the poetics and hermeneutics of Quranic narrative structure, Hebrew Bible, and Qur'an, spiritually integrative approaches to the Qur'an, Islamic feminist hermeneutics, and Islamic ethical legal theory. Her publications include the Al-Baqarah Crescendo, Understanding the Quran Style, Narrative, Structure, and Running Themes, and a co-edited volume, Islamic Interpretive Tradition and Gender Justice, Processes of Canonization, Subversion, and Change. Her articles include Reform of Usulul Fiqh and Marriage, a spiritually integrative approach, in Musawa's project Justice and Beauty in Muslim Marriage towards egalitarian ethics and laws, and Christian Practical Theology in Islam, Disciplinary Intersections and Opportunities for Growth in International Journal of Practical Theology. Over to you, Naveen, and welcome.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm always so happy to be with you. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Peace be with all of you. So in 2015, Justin Trudeau, Prime Minister of Canada, received the final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission on behalf of Canada. This commission was created as part of the Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement, the largest class action lawsuit in Canadian history. Its mandate was to document and inform all Canadians about residential schools and their legacy. Indian residential schools were coercive missionary schools established in the 19th and 20th century for the purpose of educating, assimilating, and converting Indigenous peoples to Christianity. Students in those schools suffered physical, sexual, emotional, spiritual, and cultural abuse for which they sued the government and churches. Indigenous peoples did not have a choice. They were coerced by law to send their children to these missionary schools. The last one closed in 1997. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission found that Canada engaged in physical, biological, and cultural genocide in relation to Indigenous peoples. As you can see here on the slide, there is an acknowledgement that Canada did all these things. In order to redress the legacy of residential schools and advance the process of reconciliation, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission made 94 calls to action. They include call to action number 54I, which calls on Canadians to repudiate concepts used to justify European sovereignty over Indigenous lands and peoples, such as the doctrine of discovery and terra nullius. In case anyone was wondering, we don't see here a repudiation of the doctrine of manifest destiny because it is not a Canadian doctrine. The phrase was coined by a US journalist, John Lewis Sullivan, in 1845, and manifest destiny is the idea that white Americans were destined by God and had the divinely ordained right to expand their territories and to settle the entire continent of North America, thereby displacing Indigenous peoples and maybe some others as well. The calls to action include number 60. We call upon leaders of the church parties to the settlement agreement and all other faiths. I just want to highlight church parties and all other faiths here. All other faiths includes us, it includes Muslims. We call upon leaders of the church parties to the settlement agreement and all other faiths in collaboration with Indigenous spiritual leaders, survivors, schools of theology, seminaries, and other religious training centers to develop and teach curriculum for all student clergy and all clergy and staff who work in Aboriginal communities on the need to respect Indigenous spirituality in its own right, the history and legacy of residential schools, and the roles of the church parties in that system, the history and legacy of religious conflict in Aboriginal families and communities, and the responsibility the churches have to mitigate such conflicts and prevent spiritual violence. Christian churches were among the parties sued in the Indian residential school class action lawsuit and were also part of the settlement agreement. They were receptive to the calls to action, issued apologies, implemented programs, and drafted written responses to the calls to action. Some, but not all of these written responses addressed biblical texts and papal bulls that contributed to doctrines that supported the colonial project and its abuses of Indigenous peoples and ways of being, such as the Presbyterian Church, which drafted a document repudiating the doctrine of discovery. They also proposed solutions to these problematic biblical texts, such as reading the texts like a Canaanite and reading them in light of the rest of the biblical witness. As you can see here on the document of the Presbyterian Church, you can see that here highlighted. So I really greatly appreciate the efforts of the Presbyterian Church and the United Church of Canada and other Christian churches to address these problems. As we know from the Qur'anic story of Adam and Eve, making mistakes, even grievous mistakes, is part of the human condition. And God has provided us with the tools to overcome our wrongdoings by repenting and fixing them. When Adam and Eve sinned and broke God's commandment and ate from the forbidden tree, God tells us in the Qur'an that God taught Adam words of repentance. So God gave them, and by extension us, ways by which we can fix our mistakes. God's response to Adam and Eve when they erred was not to humiliate them and tear them apart, but to teach them how to make things right again and how to learn and grow from their mistakes. So I appreciate the efforts of churches to do that. May we all learn and benefit from what God has taught us. I'm going to propose a different reading strategy for the problematic biblical texts, reading like a Muslim. Muslims are also affected by these texts and have endured and continue to endure the ravages of colonialism in many parts of the world, just like indigenous peoples here. Here on, can I have the next one slide, please? Iman? Thank you. No, the next one. Thank you so much. I removed that other one. Here on Turtle Island, the first Muslims were slaves, enslaved Africans that were brought over in the cross-Atlantic slave trade, and they were also strongly affected by the colonial project and the worldview that it promoted. Like indigenous peoples of Turtle Island, enslaved Muslims and other Africans were subjected to genocide, physical, biological, and cultural genocide. Rather than reading problematic texts in light of the rest of the biblical witness, I'm going to read them in light of the Islamic witness, the Qur'an. We bear witness that the Bible is not the final revelation and that God sent down the Qur'an to fill in some of the gaps in the Bible and the problems that may have accrued through the process of writing down the texts and redacting them. This reading strategy is one that stems from a colonized positionality, although I do also appreciate decolonial reading strategies that stem from colonizer positionalities. As we see in the calls to action, the onus is not only on Christian churches, but on all faith traditions. So after this introduction, I plan to address some of the biblical texts that have contributed to the doctrine of discovery and terra nullius, focusing specifically on biblical texts that support ethical worldviews that allow for genocide. I will then look at the Quranic texts and see how they may help us read the biblical texts in more ethical ways. My reading stems from an Islamic feminist positionality, and what is different about this particular reading is, first, that it assumes that the biblical texts are important for a deeper understanding of the Qur'an, especially the differences, since the biblical texts delineate the intellectual context that the Qur'an is addressing and vice versa. The Quranic texts are important for understanding the biblical texts because they show the unfolding nature of divine revelation and later developments in the history of the Abrahamic faith traditions. A second difference is the preoccupation with the Qur'an's ethical dimension, which is a feature of Islamic feminist exegesis of the Qur'an. My reading is a constructive reading in keeping with Islamic feminist exegesis more generally. It is inspired from a hadith of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and this is the text of the hadith, the metna of the hadith. The parable, methal, of me in relation to the prophets before me is like a man who built a house and made it beautiful and good, except for the place of one brick in a corner. People would circulate around it and wonder at its beauty, but say, if only the missing brick would be put in place. I am that brick, and I am the last of the prophets. Here on the slide, you can see a picture of a mud brick wall and a brick in the corner. The hadith says labina in Arabic, which means a raw brick or a mud brick. What I like about the prophet's parable is that it does a good job portraying the Qur'anic notion of equality between prophets and the prohibition against differentiating between them. In the Quran, God teaches us not to differentiate between messengers. لا نفرق بين أحد منهم. We bear witness that God has sent messengers to all the people on the planet. So the Haudenosaunee received a messenger, the Mississaugas of the Credit received a messenger, the Anishinaabe received one, the Mohawks, the Beothuk, and so on. And they're all equal, like bricks in a wall. Jesus, Muhammad, and Moses, peace be upon them, and all the indigenous and other messengers, peace be upon them, have all contributed something of value to that structure that we call the religion of God, and they build on each other. What the Quran does is that it completes this picture, and what we're going to see today is how it completes the biblical texts in ethical and just ways. Here on the slide, you can see a very beautiful mud brick building, which is the most elaborate one that I know of, the Great Mosque in Jenne, Mali in West Africa. So what are these problematic biblical texts? The Presbyterian Church's document identifies some of them here. I'm going to focus on a couple of them, one from the book of Deuteronomy and one from the book of Joshua. The Deuteronomy texts, because they contain the laws related to genocide, and the Joshua texts, because they portray how these laws were carried out within ancient Israelite historiography. Here is the text from Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is one of the first 5 books of Moses in the Bible. It is part of the Torah. As you can see here, there are 2 options for towns belonging to the other in Deuteronomy. The first option is to offer the town terms of peace. And here, peace means servitude and forced labor. As you can see here, if it accepts your terms of peace and surrenders to you, then all the people in it shall serve you at forced labor. If the town does not accept these terms of peace, then all the males would be murdered and the women and children enslaved. Option 2 is for certain nations in the lands that the ancient Israelites were planning to settle. And here, the inhabitants don't have the option of servitude or forced labor. They are all to be annihilated, all murdered, even babies, women, and children. You can see it here on the screen. You must not let anything that breathes remain alive. The word for annihilate them is haharem tahrimem, and this practice is called the harem or the ban in English. Harem stems from the meaning forbidden in Hebrew, and it means that it is forbidden to take captives or leave anyone alive. So the 2 options we see here are forced labor and genocide. What is important to note here is that it isn't due to anything these neighboring nations have done that they're being murdered. It is because of the other people's ethnic identity and religious practices that they're being subjected to genocide. Here's an extract from the book of Joshua, which portrays the early Israelite conquest. The book shows battle after battle and how they conquered city after city. Here on the screen, you can see the conquest of Jericho, that is Ariha in Arabic. As you can see, according to Joshua 6:21, the ancient Israelites devoted to destruction, wa yaharimo, by the edge of the sword, all in the city, both men and women, young and old, oxen, sheep, and donkeys. The ethical problems aren't the only problems with these texts. There are also archaeological problems. Iron Age 1 is when the ancient Israelites supposedly conquered Canaan. At the time of the possible entry of the ancient Israelites into Canaan, Jericho was a very small settlement without any walls. You can see here in the biblical account, there were some serious fortification walls in Jericho, but they are not borne out by the archaeological record. Another city that Joshua supposedly conquered, Gibeon, had not even been built. The city of Ai was destroyed 300 years before the ancient Israelites appeared on the scene. The account as presented in the book of Joshua does not seem to check out archaeologically. This is one of the reasons why many historians will often disregard the book of Joshua altogether and start their reconstructions of ancient Israelite history with the next biblical book, the book of Judges. Here on the slide, you can see the 7 nations that the ancient Israelites put to the sword on the map of ancient Palestine. The Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. You can see the Philistines here on the coast. I think you might just be able to make them out. And they are not included. They were likely of Mycenaean Greek origin, based on their pottery and other artifacts, and they had 5 cities: Ashdod, Ashkelon, Ekron, Gath, and Gaza. These cities were not included in the biblical ban or the herem. The rationale for why these 7 nations are to be exterminated is also not noteworthy. So the ancient Israelites do not adopt some of these nations' religious practices. It is really strange that the ancient Israelites are not expected to develop the willpower to resist temptation and maybe even teach those other nations something about monotheism. Rather, it is these other nations who are to suffer and be annihilated. The responsibility for keeping Mosaic law should really have been on the ancient Israelites. Other nations should not be punished for ancient Israelite potential wrongdoing. This rationale is not just, and God is just. What is important to note about these wars portrayed in the biblical books of Deuteronomy and Joshua is the sense of entitlement to other people's lands and subjecting them to servitude or to genocide because they happen to be religiously and ethnically other. There are eerie similarities with what happened to indigenous peoples of Turtle Island. Here on the map, you can see the island of Newfoundland, the traditional home of the Beothuk people. This indigenous nation is now extinct, just like the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. The Beothuk died either as a direct result of settler and colonizer soldiers murdering and abusing them, or of starvation due to colonizers stealing their food and other resources. Here on the slide, you can see a picture of Demesdreet, and she died in 1819. She was one of the last of the Beothuk, and she was captured by European settlers who murdered her husband, Nono Basut. And they just grabbed her and forcefully took her with them and beat up and killed members of her tribe. She died in the same year as her capture. It is important for us to remember Demesdreet and other murdered and kidnapped Indigenous women, especially since the phenomenon continues. Indigenous women are 400 times more likely to go missing or be murdered than other women in Canada. Many Indigenous nations survived the onslaught of settler colonialism. Indigenous peoples are resilient and have shown outstanding initiative and leadership skills. The class action lawsuit and the creation of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission are no small accomplishment, but a very impressive and successful undertaking. While it does not bring back the children that died within that system, nor undo its abuses, it does raise awareness to prevent further harm, and it brings some measure of justice and healing to survivors. What an accomplishment. How does the Qur'an reread the biblical texts. I'm going to begin with the legal foundation for war theory in the Qur'an, which can be found in Surah Al-Baqarah, verses 190 to 194. This foundation is in conversation with the Deuteronomy texts of, Deuteronomy 20, 10 to 18. And here is the legal passage. I have used Muhammad Abdul Halim's translation, but I have made some changes to it to highlight some of the linguistic nuances in the Arabic. According to the translation, the first verse states, "Fight in the cause of God against those who fight you, but do not attack, transgress limits. Ta'tadu, God does not love aggressors." Here you find the who of war, who Muslims are allowed to go to war against. The Arabic word ta'tadu here doesn't have a semantic equivalence in the English language. It means something along the lines of commit aggression. And in Arabic, it has both the meaning of to initiate an attack and to transgress limits. I have translated it as attack, transgress limits in the first time it occurs, and I have translated its second occurrence in the active participle mu'tadin as aggressors. And you can see it here on the screen. The imperative verb fight, as in fight in the cause of God, is an imperative of permission. In Arabic, فعل أمر بمعنى الإباحة. It also has the meaning of kill, as in combat, where each party is trying to kill the other. Here, Muslims are given permission to go to war against the ones who fight and kill Muslims. So the who here is the ones who are actively engaged in fighting and killing Muslims. This is a very different scenario than what you find in the biblical texts. In the Qur'an, it is no longer about who the other person is, but rather what they do. It isn't about the other person's ethnic identity or their religious practice, but rather whether or not they attack and fight Muslims. As you can see in this verse, Muslims are not allowed to initiate hostilities or to transgress limits. War can only be a defensive war in self-defense. The verse also explains why. God does not love those who attack and those who transgress limits in war. So if people think that God loves the ones who run around engaging in genocide, they should think again. The verse here states very clearly, God does not love aggressors. In Islamic law, women, children, and the elderly are not to be killed, since they are not actively involved in fighting and killing. As you can see here, those who fight you would normally not include non-combatants and civilians. The next verse describes the where of war, where Muslims may engage in combat. Kill them wherever you encounter them, and drive them out from where they drove you out. For persecution is more grievous than killing. But do not fight them at the forbidden mosque unless they fight you there. But if they fight you, then kill them. This is what the ones who cover deserve. The Arabic word kafaru that I've translated here as the ones who cover is more often translated as unbeliever or disbeliever in English. And in the Quran, it is used as an opposite of believer. However, the linguistic meaning and the etymology of kafaru is not to disbelieve, but to cover. In the Quran, it is associated with covering up the heart or one's reasoning faculties, covering up the truth with falsehood, or covering up the blessings of God. The problem with translating kafaru as disbeliever or unbeliever is that we are reducing God to an imaginary concept that one can believe in or reject, whereas in the Islamic tradition, God is real. God is the meaning behind creation. Wherever we turn, there is the face of God. Here in this verse, there are exclusions to where Muslims may engage in combat and an ongoing war. The forbidden mosque, al-Masjid al-Haram, in Arabic, which is the ancient sanctuary in Mecca. Linguistically, haram means forbidden in Arabic. It is the cognate of the same root as the biblical haram or ban. It comes from the same root, except that it has a very different meaning in the Qur'an. Whereas in the Hebrew Bible, leaving the others alive is forbidden, in the Qur'an, killing them is forbidden. Masjid means the place where we prostrate ourselves in prayer. So, house of worship. In Islamic law, houses of worship, including mosques, churches, and synagogues, are considered sanctuaries where people may not engage in combat. If any fighters or murderers seek asylum there, they are safe, and one may not attack them in there unless they start killing people there first. In Islam, killing another person is the most grievous sin after shirk. Shirk means taking up partners with God, that is, worshiping other gods alongside God. This verse also provides the rationale as to why Muslims may engage in war, which involves killing, which is a sin. The verse explains that persecution, fitna, is worse than murder. Ethnic cleansing and religious persecution is worse than killing. So putting an end to religious persecution and ethnic cleansing is a justifiable reason for going to war, maybe even the only justifiable reason. The next verse explains when Muslims must stop, and it is if the other party stops fighting and turns to peace. But if they stop, then God is most forgiving and merciful. And you can see it also in the next verse. Fight them, so there is no more persecution, and religion belongs to God. But if they stop, then let there be no more aggression except against transgressors. Here again, you see the rationale. War is allowed, so there is religious freedom. So no more religious persecution and ethnic cleansing. Religion belongs to God, or religion is unto God, وَيَكُونُ الدِّينُ لِلَّهِ, means that it doesn't belong to anyone else. No one has the right to define what is religion and then force it onto others. No one can come between a person and God. In the Egyptian Revolution of 1919, which included Muslims and Christians demonstrating against the British colonizers, the slogan was, "Ad-dinu lillah wal watan lil jamia." Religion belongs to God, and the homeland is for everyone. And the first part of the slogan stems directly from the Qur'an. Religion belongs to God. So religion, whether Islam or Christianity, is between a person and God. No one has the right to interfere, but the homeland is for everyone, whether Muslim or Christian or another religion. In the sentence, let there be no more aggression, except against transgressors, فَلَا عِدْوَانَ إِلَّا عَلَى الظَّالِمِينَ. Transgressors, in today's terms, may mean something along the lines of war criminals, people who have transgressed all ethical boundaries in war. Finally, we have some more limitations. A forbidden month is for a forbidden month. Violation of the forbidden calls for fair retribution. So if anyone attacks you, attack him to the extent that he attacked you, but be mindful of God and know that God is with those who are mindful. In pre-Islamic Arabia, long before the Prophet Muhammad's birth, the tribes had all agreed that there were 4 months of the year in which combat was forbidden, and it was to allow for people to perform the pilgrimage to Mecca. Here in this verse, you see some further ethical considerations to be mindful not to exceed limits. If the other party violates the taboo of fighting during one of the four forbidden months or another taboo, then Muslims may retaliate in kind. There are also limitations in terms of the extent of the retaliation. One may not exceed the aggression of the other party. For example, if the other party attacks and kills 10 people, one can't retaliate by killing 1,000. These are some of the limitations that you see here. And there's a strong warning. God warns people to be mindful of God and cautious when retaliating in kind. These verses are the foundation of war theory in the Quran. In the remaining surahs, you find some fine-tunings and what to do in special circumstances. For example, what to do when one has a treaty and then the other party breaks it, and so on. However, here, in these verses, you find the basic ethical framework for engaging in war. The narrative passage that we saw earlier on the conquest of Jericho, or Ariha, is from the book of Joshua. And as mentioned, there are problems in this book, not only with the conquest of Jericho, but with several other cities as well. So how does the Quran point to a solution there? Interestingly, there is no Joshua in the Quran. There are 6 verses in Surah Al-Baqarah that mention the ancient Israelite conquests, but they do not mention a Joshua. The guy's name in the Quran is Talut, which stems from the Arabic root meaning to be tall. So this was a very tall guy. He's usually equated to King Saul, the first king of ancient Israel in the Bible. Just to clarify things a bit here, let's take a look at the biblical chronology so we can see where Joshua and Saul are located. The Protestant Old Testament has 39 books, and the Catholic and Orthodox even more. The Jewish Bible has 24 books, organized a bit differently than what you see here. It has 3 major divisions: the Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim, or the Tanakh. The Torah, or the Pentateuch, consists of the first 5 books of Moses, and you can see them listed here on the screen. The book of Deuteronomy is the last of these books. So it's the last of the first 5 books of Moses, the last of the Torah. Then comes Joshua, followed by the book of Judges, which describes 12 figures that led the ancient Israelite tribes before they elected a king in the book of 1 Samuel. The book of Samuel is where King Saul, or Talut, appears. To cut a long story short, the 6 verses pertaining to Talut in the Quran seem to be reading some of the biblical books and narratives in parallel. They seem to be actually saying that Joshua, Gideon, and King Saul are one and the same historical person. The identification of Joshua and Saul may not be as far-fetched or as new as one might think. Some historians, such as J. Maxwell Miller and John Hayes, have proposed that some of the archaeologically problematic Joshua narratives may actually be misplaced accounts that pertain to King Saul. There may also be some other narratives in the book of Judges that originally featured Saul as well, such as the story of Samson and Delilah. This parallel or synoptic reading of Joshua and some of the other narratives solves some of the archaeological and ethical problems in the book of Joshua. Why would the ancient writers place accounts consecutively that may originally have been independent, isolated accounts that featured the same historical personage? Some scholars suggest that the biblical account, or what they call the Deuteronomistic history, was put together sometime in the 6th century BCE, when ancient Israelites had just returned from the exile in Babylon, and they were trying to answer an important question. Should they appoint a king for themselves or not? I think the sequential organization is trying to answer that question by making an argument for not having a king, by extending and emphasizing the role of charismatic judge-like figures such as Joshua and the 12 leaders portrayed in the book of Judges. And God knows better. As we can see here from this presentation, the ethical, legal, and historiographical foundations for war theory are portrayed very differently in the Bible and in the Quran. Biblical scholars coined the term holy war to refer to the biblical wars. Gerhard von Rad is probably the earliest to use that term. He wrote a book called Heilige Krieg im alten Israel, which translates as Holy War in ancient Israel. Other biblical scholars prefer to use Yahweh War to refer to the same phenomenon. They include Rudolf Smend and William Jones. The problem with the term Yahweh War is that it implies that somehow God may have approved or even mandated the biblical wars when, from an Islamic perspective, God did not, at least not as they are portrayed in the Bible. We really don't want to be attributing these wars to God, astaghfirullah. God is just and compassionate, and there's nothing just or compassionate about these wars. What is important for us to note is that the term holy war does not stem from the Islamic tradition at all. It stems from biblical scholarship. Holy war would be harb muqaddasa in Arabic, and we do not have that term in Islam at all. As we all know, jihad means struggle, and in the Qur'an, it refers to many kinds of struggles, both internal with the inner self and external, which can include war. Just to quickly summarize the two different ethical legal worldviews when it comes to the Qur'an and the Hebrew scriptures, the Bible depicts the ancient wars as an aggressive war. In the Qur'an, it is a defensive war. In the Bible, war has an ethnic and religious connotations. It is for reasons of the ethnicity and religious identity of the other. In the Quran, it is only if they attack first. So it is about what the other party does, not who the other party is. In the Bible, there is no freedom of religion. The reason why the other is being annihilated is because of their religious practices and the fear that the ancient Israelites may adopt them. Whereas in the Quran, it is for freedom of religion, to ensure that no one can obstruct a person's spiritual seeking and their path to God. In the Bible, there are no sanctuaries for asylum seekers. In the Quran, places of worship function as sanctuaries. There were no schools or hospitals in the Prophet's day and age, just the mosque. But in today's world, one might extend that protection to such places, since children and the sick are generally non-combatants. In the Quran, there are limitations to aggression. One needs to be mindful of God and not exceed the violations of the other party. In the Bible, there is no turning to peace. Peace means forced labor and servitude for the other party. Unless they happen to be from the 7 nations, then genocide is the only option. The rules and limitations to war that we see mentioned in the Quran are not easy to enact. If someone has the power and the motivation, and they see their friends and colleagues dying around them, it becomes difficult for them to restrain themselves and keep themselves from going off on a murdering spree or other excesses. However, in Surah Al-Baqarah and throughout the Quran, self-restraint and mindfulness of God isn't only for when things are easy or when we are not challenged. It is precisely in difficult circumstances that we are tested and that our true mettle shows itself. Battle is one of those situations. So jihad is not holy war. Jihad means struggle, and it is the struggle with the self and the ego. Either when we put in the work to restrain ourselves from doing bad things, or when we make an effort to keep on going and doing good things in difficult circumstances. War can be a jihad if it follows ethical guidelines because of the inner struggle with the self. Jihad is similar to the English word activism because it entails fighting for the oppressed and for justice and freedom of religion. The difference between the two terms is that jihad has both an outer and an inner dimension. As we struggle outwardly, we also grow inwardly. As we can see, the biblical and Quranic war regulations are nothing alike, so we really should not be using the term holy war in connection with jihad or Islam at all. This term relates to the biblical wars and arose in biblical scholarship. Qur'anic war theory is revolutionary and allows for people to live peacefully together without transgression. It is fair to everyone. There was nothing like this in the 7th century when the Qur'an was revealed, either in Arabia or anywhere else in the world. We see a similar development in the 20th century with the creation of the United Nations, but it took the world a long time to catch up, more than 1,000 years. Colonialism is not only about acquiring other people's lands and cultural accomplishments. It is also about taking a colonizer's negativity and violence and imposing it on the image of the colonized. There's a two-way traffic here. The colonizers take everything that is good from the colonized and then imposes upon them everything that is bad about the colonizers. Holy war is one of those things. Colonizers rid themselves of the concept of holy war and attribute it to us, even though it's not true. We really should be saying, no, this is yours. Take responsibility for it and stop throwing it at us. We don't want it. Just as colonizers have attempted to impose the notion of holy war upon Muslims and to equate it to the Islamic notion of jihad in the colonizer language, we see a similar phenomenon with depictions of indigenous peoples as savage and violent, which is also very unfair. To conclude, there are different ways for dealing with the problematic biblical texts related to war theory and genocide. We examined texts from Deuteronomy and Joshua today. Some people may read them literally, and it may inform their ethical worldviews. There have been many instances of genocide in the past, and they continue. Some Christians and Jews have developed reading strategies to deal with these texts in constructive ways, such as the Presbyterian Church's method of reading like a Canaanite and reading these texts in light of the rest of the biblical witness. As Muslims, we acknowledge that there is guidance in the Bible. No book that speaks of the love of God and the love of neighbor does not have a core of truth, even if some of the texts may not have been accurately preserved. The reading strategy that I have presented here, reading the texts from a Muslim positionality in light of the Qur'anic witness. So that's what I've presented here. And in this reading, the Qur'anic texts complete the Bible and update its laws while pointing to novel ways of reading the narratives that are more ethical and reasonable. In this reading method, it is assumed that the Qur'anic text is in conversation with the Bible and that differences are intentional, while early Muslim exegetes looked to the similarities and the details that they could glean from the biblical accounts to write fuller versions of the Qur'anic stories. Here, I'm saying that the differences are also important. Reading the Bible can help us gain a deeper understanding of the Qur'an and the ethical message it promotes, and vice versa. Reading the Qur'an can help us gain a deeper understanding of the Bible and God at work in the process of revelation. There's a lot that we can learn from each other and each other's texts. It may be that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada has opened the door for far more introspection into colonizer and colonized relations and a great deal of learning and growth. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Naveen. That was really rich. There was a lot there, lots of food for thought. So we do have a few questions, and let's take them. The first question is, how does those who transgress limits get interpreted through history? It seems rather vague.
Right. So the Arabic in that first line is wala ta'tadu, right? Ta'tadu. So the problem is, how does one translate that word into English when there's no exact equivalent? So it actually it means to so transgress limits is one of the ways in which it can be translated, and it actually doesn't state exactly what those limits are, or but i'tida or ta'tadu, generally speaking, means something in the nature of attack and a violent attack going beyond all bounds. So historically in Islamic law, based on the Qur'an and based on Hadith, people have outlined certain limits, such as, not killing women and children, not burning trees or destroying livestock, that kind of thing. So, what are these limits? Again, is is subject to interpretation. Uh, yeah. Uh, but definitely non-combatants and civilians tend to be out of that equation. Does that answer your question?
I hope it does. Um, there was a question in the chat, which I'll go back to. Um, so I was wondering whether Dr. Rida could expand on why the term "the ones who cover" better captures the intended message than the term unbelievers.
Yeah, so most translations will translate it as disbeliever or unbeliever, and these are good translations. They're not bad translations, but the reason why I don't like them is because I like to dig a little bit deeper into the way the language works and what are the underlying assumptions in that language, in the way we express ourselves. So when we say believer and disbeliever, unbeliever and believer, and use these two words as as opposites in our language, we hint or we imply that God is actually a concept that we can believe in or disbelieve. But what we see in the Quran, the etymology is actually to cover. So the root meaning is in Arabic is satara. Satara means to cover. So it doesn't mean to disbelieve or to reject faith. It literally means to cover. So, and we see it in the Quran used in connection with covering one's heart, covering the truth with falsehood, covering, one's eyes, ears, and minds. So that's how it's used in the Quran. So when we translate it as the ones who cover, we are not suggesting that God is a imaginary or a make-believe concept. We're actually acknowledging that God is real, because again, everything around us is real. The universe is real, and the universe is a reflection of God's attributes. The universe is, there's a creator behind it, and the creator's attributes are all around us. Wherever we turn, there's the face of God. So our approach to God tends to be very different. So when we use the ones who cover instead of disbelievers or unbelievers, we are actually saying that we are actually suggesting that they're actually covering, the truth, instead of, relegating God to something that could potentially not be real.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Very interesting. So
Yeah.
I don't see any more questions, but I have a question for you.
Okay.
You know, it's the way you presented this information and
Mhm.
the contrast between the biblical reading and the Quranic reading, they're almost the opposite, you
Mhm.
know. They're very misrepresented,
Mhm.
whereas Islam is represented as a violent religion, and that the Muslims are the aggressors. And I know I've always tried to explain to people that actually in Islam it's forbidden to attack first. You only fight if you are
Mhm.
attacked. So, but that concept is not understood. And sadly, I don't think it's really understood by Muslims themselves. Because, I've heard people say, um, that we are entitled to wage war, but but it's so clear that you only do that if someone is waging war against you. So why is there's such a disconnect between what people believe, is in the Bible
Mhm.
and just the example of sanctuaries.
Mhm.
Um, Mosques have always been sanctuaries, you know.
Mhm.
And churches, they say churches are sanctuaries. Um, and then, it's like the reading of the two faiths is so different, and the representation of violence or genocide or um, the right to, transgress or to be aggressive. It's very interesting. So can you shed some light on why this complete misreading and why they're so different from one another?
So Edward Said wrote a very important book called Orientalism, and he explains some of that.
Mhm.
So uh, the movement of colonialism is accompanied by a particular worldview and a particular discourse and a particular representation of the other who are being colonized. So it doesn't matter what the truth is. It doesn't matter what reality is. Uh, the intent, what's being accomplished is, or what's being done is to represent the other in a way that justifies colonialism, that justifies the genocide and the violence that is committed against them. It's almost as if, they deserve it. Or people, when they're actually colonizing, whether it's Muslims or indigenous peoples, it's as if, they're actually doing them a favor because they're civilizing them and bringing them, certain ways of being and certain approaches. So that tends to be the reason why you find these misrepresentations. And with some people, it doesn't matter what the texts say. It doesn't matter what you tell them. These are the ones that the Quran portrays as, people that are all covered up. Their eyes, ears, and hearts are covered up. They're all closed in. Doesn't matter, you're not going to get through to them. And with those people, it's best to leave them alone because, why waste your time and your energy? It's not going to make a difference. But then there's a second group of people, and these are the people that God portrays as being astray. And it is these people that that are open to listening, that might make a difference if they, that speaking to them, entering into a dialogue with them might make a difference. Why do Muslims think that? And it has to do with a couple of things. First of all, because of the media. I mean, we hear left and right and from many different sources that Muslims are violent. So we start believing it. Some of us don't realize what is our history, what is our text, where does all this violence come from, and who's actually the perpetrator in this violence. So some of us don't have enough knowledge of our own religion, our own history, our own texts to be able to resist these negative images that you see all over the media. There are there's another problem, and this is something that some Muslims will do and also some Orientalists will do, and that is to read the texts atomistically. And by what atomistically I mean, take a little piece of a text out of the verse or out of the context. So, for example, kill them wherever you find them, full stop. So they wouldn't say, what is the verse before it? What is the rest of this verse? They'll just take that piece of a verse out of the entire passage and say, well, this is what the Quran teaches. This is what Islam says. Kill them wherever you find them. And I actually saw once on YouTube, I think it was, or was it on TV, a while back when children in Mississauga, or maybe Mississauga and Brampton, in schools wanted to be able to perform the prayer inside the public school system, and they were protesting. And so there was this young girl, and there was a middle-aged woman, a white middle-aged woman, and she was, talking to that little Muslim girl very aggressively and telling her, well, kill them wherever you find them. That's what's in your texts. And she actually used that piece of a verse. So that little girl, maybe she doesn't know, right? But this is the kind of discourse that we're subjected to. So it's important for us to know and to be, calm and to be patient and to be able to respond objectively without getting emotional and, maybe looked at ourselves as teachers, showing, people like this, middle-aged white woman that, this is not acceptable, that this is not appropriate. This is no way to talk to a little child or, to talk about others without actually looking and, seeing what does the text actually say. But I've also seen that in actually textbooks written by top-notch scholars, Orientalist scholars, who will take that little piece of a verse out and then say, oh, Islam is a violent religion, but you know what? All religions are violent. Well, no, Islam is not a violent religion, and it really wouldn't be fair to be comparing Islam to, or the Quran to other texts in this manner.
Thank you. I think there might be some more questions, but I did have a follow, but I'll ask after we've addressed. So there's a few more questions. Can you please comment on the Amalek reference by Netanyahu and how that connects with the Bible?
Can I please comment on what? Sorry?
On the Amalek reference by Netanyahu and how that connects with the Bible, the whole land thing, that all belongs to the Jews, so that they're entitled to, like, they're ordained to do that, take over that land. I think that's what that doctrine is.
Okay, so I haven't heard that Amalek reference, but I can speak to the Amalekites. So the Amalekites, these are a group of people that occur in the Bible, and in Arabic, they're the Amalek. So Amalek in Arabic means giants. So these
Yeah.
are people that had a very tall stature, and it may be why Talut or Saul, King Saul, it was really needed for someone to be very tall as a leader, because the other party was really very tall. So, according to Arabian historiography, the Amalekites actually, at a certain point in time, they had reached all the way to Mecca. But again, that was long before the Prophet Muhammad's day and age, many centuries before. So they controlled many of these areas at certain points in time. There were many other peoples there. Again, the question that we have to ask ourselves, what does love your neighbor mean? Is this something we take seriously, or is it something we use apologetically? Does love your neighbor mean run around killing them, or does love your neighbor mean behaving to them in decent and compassionate ways? So so there are different ways of reading these texts.
So I think, Shaheen, you're referring to the previous question, the Amalek question. Is it in the New Testament as well? Not
The
sure.
Amalekites, no, I don't think so. I would have to check and see, but I don't think so, because they were much earlier than Jesus, peace be upon him.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Next question is, the process of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was to gather witnesses, survivors, listen to them, and to compile the 94 recommendations from them. How can we promote this process in similar situations?
Yeah, so again, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is a fantastic accomplishment. Again, indigenous peoples did a fantastic job there. So again, we should read the 94 calls to action. This is something that addresses all Canadians, and see what they say and take them seriously and promote them and raise awareness about them. And also about, what happened to Indigenous peoples and the history of residential schools, and how we might, avoid further abuses of Indigenous peoples on Turtle Island. So this could be one way forward.
And also, from what I can gather in the question, so it happened in Canada, where there was a lot of listening of from in the community, and what the experience had been of Indigenous peoples in this country, particularly their residential school experience. Similar things have happened in places like New Zealand, for instance, and also, of course, in South Africa. So I guess, I hope, inshallah, one day they will do the same, with the Palestinian genocide. Listen to the people of Palestine about their experiences and their annihilation. So we can only pray that that happens, because no one is listening right now. There's another question that's really interesting. Many say that Islam was spread by the sword. So could you please speak to that, as I am confused about this too?
Yeah, so again, as you noted in the biblical text, the sword stems from the Bible. It really does not stem from the Qur'an. And this is another one of those instances of two-way traffic, where the colonizer will take ideas within their own tradition and then impose it upon others. So one of the really important contributions of the Islamic tradition to the world is actually the notion of freedom of religion. The Quran says very clearly, "La ikraha fid din," which means let there be no coercion in religion. And the way that played out in Islamic history is that in Muslim ruled contexts, you had different religious groups living side by side. So that was called in the Ottoman Empire, which is very recent. It was called the millet system. The millah means religious groups, and so they had the rights to worship freely, to have their own schools, have their own law courts, apply their own laws, raise their children in whatever way they wanted. So they had a limited amount of self-governance, but they had to pay a tax, and Muslims also had to pay a tax. So everybody had to pay a tax, and they had to, recognize the state authority. So this was novel. Europe wasn't like that. It was illegal to be anything other than Christian for many centuries. And in many parts of Europe, definitely in Spain. And what happened in the 1700s is, and later, people observed this millet system and how Muslims, Christians, and Jews, and Manichaeans, and Mandaeans, and Zoroastrians, and a whole bunch of different religious traditions and different kinds of Muslims, and lived side by side peacefully in the same city, in the same country. So European Christians saw that and said, well, this is great, and we should have that too. I mean, this is in keeping with our religion and our teachings. And you see people like John Locke, for example, come up with a notion of religious tolerance, and it was based on observing what religious freedom meant in Muslim societies. And so this is where the notion of freedom of religion and religious tolerance started. And we also see it in Thomas Jefferson in the US. He also learned that. I mean, he was a great promoter of religious freedom and tolerance. And he learned that also from observing it in the Ottoman Empire. And he actually had a copy of the Qur'an translated into English, one of the earlier copies. So this is what it meant. But we have to bear in mind that religious freedom meant something different in Muslim contexts, in pre-modern, pre-colonial Muslim contexts than it does today in Canada and in many parts of Europe and the Americas. Because in the Muslim context, it meant that people, that there was a recognition that there can be different ethical systems at work. People live by their own ethics, and people recognize that ethical reasoning doesn't always arrive at the same conclusion. So it didn't only mean freedom to practice and worship in the way they wanted. It also went deeper than that. And this is something that we lack, I think, in Canada. And we see that in the example of the residential schools, where you have one group of people, the dominant group, deciding what is ethical and then imposing it on Indigenous peoples, instead of recognizing that their laws and their ways of being had their own ethical underpinnings too. So this is something that we can continue to learn from the Islamic, the pre-colonial, pre-Muslim, pre-colonial, pre-modern Muslim societies.
Yes, and I certainly agree, Shaheen, that Islam was spread by Sufis and many other messengers and people who traveled the world who shared the learnings, from the Prophet with others. That's really how it happened. So thank you for that. Actually, I'm going to go back to that Amalek question. I think one of the things that I recall, and Shaheen, you can correct me, it was more the sort of the violent takeover, of like that you could use any means whatsoever, um, like stopping the food, the fuel and the water and just go and take the land, take it back. So I don't know where that came from, but if from what I recall, it has a violent kind of takeover idea, as opposed to just saying that this land belonged to a certain people and now we're going to take it back. I think it had the concept of aggression or taking it by force, um, by, through ethnic cleansing, through starvation. But I could be wrong. I could be completely wrong. But, that was the kind of thing that I recall Netanyahu's, using at the time because it happened right after October 7th that they were talking about it. So it was it was pretty violent. Not just the fact that this land should be taken back, but it should be done by starving and basically committing genocide. Um, so I think, Elizabeth, you have a question here. Do you have a book that would help me learn about the Ottoman Empire's influence on Christianity? This I would appreciate very much. So can you recommend a book that talks about the influence of the Ottoman Empire on Christianity?
No, I don't have a book, but you could read the letters and the writings of John Locke. And he was a British thinker, and Locke is spelled Locke. So you could read what he had to say. Yeah.
Thank you, Wafa, for that clarification that what I was just talking about was it's used to justify aggression to babies or sucklings. Absolutely. It's the violence, the genocide, the ethnic cleansing aspect of it.
The term that I'm familiar with is the harem. But again, what's important to note is in the Hebrew Bible is the different nations that are mentioned. The Philistines are not among them.
Right.
Yeah.
And
So
that's
yeah,
really
and then these
interesting.
peoples are all dead and gone. And definitely the Amalekites are all dead and gone. So what we have now, the people now identify as Arab. They don't identify as Amalekites or Jebusites or Perizzites. I mean, these nations are no more.
Right. Well, thank you. Are there any more questions? Did I miss anyone? If I did, please do let us know or raise your hand and I'll find you, or not, or you can put your question in the Q&A box. Thank you, Shaheen. I don't think we have any more questions. We have lots of thanks and lots of compliments, Naveen, of course, as usual. You
Oh,
opened
thank
your
you
eyes.
so much.
Yes, there will be a recording and there will be we're just putting the post-event survey in the chat, but you'll also receive it by email, as well as you will be notified when the recording becomes available so you can share it with others. So thank you so very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Questions?
Yeah,
Yeah.
so if anyone's interested in the parallel reading of
Mm.
that I mentioned, I've
Mhm.
actually written an article on that. It's called, what is it called again? Sorry.
Can you share it with Zainab and she can send it out
Yep,
as a
yep, I
recording?
can share the name. It's yeah, I wrote it in 2008. It was one of the first articles I wrote. It was before I actually finished my PhD. I was still a student back then. And it was about King Saul and Talut, and it was an intertextual reading. So if anybody's interested in that, and yeah, I can send it to Zainab. Thank you.
I remember the question I wanted to ask you.
Yeah.
So when you presented these two readings,
Mhm.
the Bible and the Quran on this topic, um, what has been the reaction of the Christian listeners to your presentation or to that parallel reading idea?
Okay, so the parallel reading idea, I've actually was a bit different. Like I went more deeply into the archaeological and what was an intertextual reading. It was a bit more academic. So, and I presented a very long time ago. It wasn't the same presentation as here, but I think it's important to note that many Christians and Jews today will read the Bible in what they would call a historical critical method. So many will not take these texts literally, and some people will, and with some people it will inform their ethics and worldviews, but others won't. So there are many different ways of reading them, and the Christians and Jews that I know will generally use a historical critical reading of the Bible and not take them literally.
Great. And
So
so should be true for Muslims. Absolutely. So thank you so much. Nina, I see you're here. How are you feeling? Do you want to close?
If it's okay with you, I won't, but I'm in bed
Oh dear.
watching.
Okay.
Thank you, Naveen. You're amazing, mashallah. May God
thank
bless you.
you.
Take care.
Thank you so much for having me here. I'm so delighted to be here. Thank you
We
for
could
all
have
this
you every
wonderful
day.
audience and all these wonderful questions.
Thank you. So we can conclude. I just want to, pray that what we're doing is helping us learn, and having God guide us in this learning. And Naveen, you sharing what God has been teaching you all these years, and how you honestly, I don't know what else to say, but it's internalizing that learning and teaching, and the fact that you've given of yourself to us so that we can learn. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Nusrat. And I wouldn't be where I am today if it weren't for CCMW and CCMW's support. I mean, you guys had my back in every single thing that I've done. Thank you so much.
Love
Where
you.
would we all be without you guys? Thank you so
Alhamdulillah.
much.
Thank you. And Thanks, everyone who
Alhamdulillah.
joined us on a Friday evening. You're all very kind. May you have a beautiful rest of Friday, what's left, and then enjoy your weekend with your families. And may you all be blessed. And until next time, in our Muslim Women Scholar Series, we shall see you soon. And thank you, Zainab and Iman, for all that behind the scenes work and getting us organized. And the rest of the CCMW team for promoting the event, and once again, Emmanuel College for their support. Okay, everyone, thank you.